back to tonight's Conversations with Great Minds with Richard Heinberg. His most recent book, Snake Oil, How Fracking's False Promise of Plenty Imperils Our Future. He's also a senior fellow in residence at the Post-Carbon Institute. Richard, you were talking about in the last segment how oil is so essential to transportation and agriculture, and yet it is a finite resource. We are approaching peak oil, or have already hit it, arguably, in the United States. And what do we do about that?
Well, ultimately, we're going to have to learn how to use less. There's no question about that. Of course, the industry would like us to think that there's no problem, that that oil supplies are sufficient, and even if there is some kind of difficulty with oil production, then we can always fall back on powering the transport sector with natural gas. But we at Post-Carbon Institute see that as actually just as big a problem. The transformation of the natural gas industry over the past few years toward much greater reliance on unconventional gas, mostly in the form of shale gas, has been really dramatic.
Gas.
Yeah, exactly, using hydrofracturing or fracking and horizontal drilling to produce natural gas from tight rocks, usually shale. These are geologic formations that we knew about for a long time, but there was no incentive to get that gas out because it was so much cheaper and easier to produce conventional natural gas. Well, conventional natural gas in the U.S. is declining very substantially, and currently half of our national natural gas production is coming from these shale resources. And again, we're told that there's an abundance of this stuff it'll last 100 years. But the evidence is just not there to support those assertions.
So what do well, first of all, if natural gas is going through the same cycle that oil went through, King Hubbard back in the 50s was able to put together this, that, and the other thing, look at all the data points and all the information from around the world and the United States and predict when we would hit peak oil, and he was pretty damn accurate. Has anybody done that work with regard to fracked gas? Do we know when peak fracking is going to occur? Well,
actually, we've done that work at Post-Carbon Institute. We purchased the proprietary rights to the drilling information on over 65,000 wells that are currently fracked and horizontally drilled in various geologic formations in the United States. We looked at the location of each well, the initial production rate, the evolution of production over time. What we found is that within each of these geologic formations, there's a small core area, or you could call it a sweet spot, where initial production is fairly prolific, and it continues for a while. Outside of those sweet spots, initial production rates are much lower, and production declines very rapidly. Actually, for all shale gas, production tends to decline much more rapidly than for conventional natural gas. So we're talking about a decline in production of maybe 70% or more in the first year. So that means companies that drill for shale gas have to drill and drill and drill in order just to keep production flat. In many ways, this is almost like a real estate bubble, a sort of pump and dump scheme. It sort of goes like this. First, you borrow some money, go out and purchase thousands of acres of drilling leases, and borrow some more money and go in and drill a bunch of wells and start producing shale gas or tight oil. Then you say, looky here, we're producing all this unconventional oil and gas, and there's lots of this stuff. Everybody's going to get rich. That raises the value of those assets. And then even if the company isn't making money on actual production of product, which is the case for most of these companies, they're actually heavily in debt and not making money on sales of product because it's so expensive to produce this stuff, then what they do is to turn around and sell off their assets, which are the drilling leases, to other companies that are later getting into the game. Most of the companies that specialize in producing shale gas and tight oil are heavily indebted. and are showing negative cash flow on actual production, but manage to stay profitable through sales of assets. So this is almost the definition of a bubble.
Wow. What kind of time frame are we looking at? Is this bubble going to burst in 2 years, 10 years, 30 years?
Well, our analysis suggests that the available good drilling sites are being drilled out pretty rapidly in most of these plays. Some of the shale gas plays... Is this just in the United
States, you mean, or around the world?
In the United States.
Okay.
Some of the shale gas plays in the U.S. are already in decline. And within the Bakken tight oil play in North Dakota, for example, it's really all up to one county. And when that county is drilled out, McKenzie County, then effectively North Dakota's oil production is going to go into decline. So we're not talking about decades. We're talking about a few years, almost certainly before the end of the current decade.
Wow. Yeah, I think most Americans don't realize that back, a century ago, from New Jersey across Pennsylvania all the way to Michigan and Ohio, there were all these oil wells.
Right.
And, Pennzoil was Pennsylvania oil. There was a lot of oil there, and then they just drilled it all out. It's all gone. So you're talking about that same thing. So as a response to this, what do we do? You've talked about economic growth being over, a post-growth world where our economy for centuries has been built on growth. Is that a solution to say, hey, wait a minute, stasis is a good idea?
Well, actually, even though economies have been growing since the beginning of the fossil fuel era, just a couple of centuries ago, we didn't get hooked on economic growth as we now think of it until pretty much the third quarter of the 20th century, after World War II, basically. We adopted GDP, or gross domestic product, as a measure of economic health, and economic growth became sort of the be-all and end-all. Every politician promises more economic growth. We have our financial institutions, government financing, all depending upon economic growth. And yet, we live on a finite planet. And if energy sources are not able to continue to give us more and more abundant, cheap energy, then there isn't the basic physical wherewithal to maintain economic growth as we've known it over this historically very short period of time. So what is likely to happen is we'll revert to the norm. If you look back further in history, essentially people have lived pretty much the same from generation to generation. This was the pre-economic growth era. We will revert to that norm one way or another, whether it's through a planned kind of steady state economy, or whether it's simply through economic failure and contraction, recession after recession, each one getting a little bit worse until we're living within nature's budget of energy and resources.
If you look at the story of the Maori or in New Zealand or numerous Native American tribes and other Aboriginal people, I mean, there's no shortage of these stories. They find an area that's rich in natural resources or lots and lots of moa birds to eat. Go nuts for a couple of generations, eat the place to death, kill off all the easily available animals, and then basically their economy crashes. And then typically, New Zealand got interrupted in this process, although New Caledonia didn't. They figure out how to live in equilibrium with their environment. Is that the sort of thing that you're proposing?
Right, right. That's a great observation, because some of us tend to think of indigenous peoples as sort of intuitive ecologists. They have all this traditional ecological wisdom. Well, why is that? It's because they lived in one place long enough to bump up against these ecological limits, and they realized through trial and error that we have to respect those limits. Now, fossil fuels have been an amazing gift. They've enabled us to do things we wouldn't otherwise have been able to do. A lot of people got rich. We developed technologies, communication, on and on and on. But they've also propelled us into a situation of ecological overshoot. In other words, we've increased our rates of consumption above what the Earth can sustainably provide. So that means one way or another, we've got to rein ourselves back in as a species until we are within Earth's sustainable budget of resources.
So let's take this out of the abstract. What's step one? What do we do?
Well, step one is to look at fossil fuels themselves, because we face two enormous challenges with fossil fuels. First, the fact that they're finite, which we've been talking about, and also the problem that as we burn them, we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, change the climate. So we know we have to get off of fossil fuels, and doing so is going to change our economy. It's not like we can, unplug fossil fuels and plug in renewable energy sources and just keep living exactly the way we are right now. It's not going to work that way. We're going to have to rethink agriculture, transportation, finance, and all the other big sectors of our economy. Agriculture, because right now we have a food system that's overwhelmingly dependent on fossil fuels. Transportation, the same thing. Our financial system is hooked on perpetual growth to pay off investors with ever larger interest and returns on investments. None of that is going to work in a post-growth, post-carbon, or post-fossil fuel society. Right. That doesn't mean it's the end of the world.
Richard, we just have a minute left.
Yeah.
Do you see any way we can make this transition to a world that works without first there being a crash?
Well, theoretically, yes. I think it's unlikely that we'll make that transition without some kind of crash. I mean, we've been through a crash just recently, and we didn't seem to learn that much from it. We had the opportunity to transition our financial system, but so far it hasn't happened. I think we're going to see some more hard knocks before we really wake up. Again, that doesn't mean it's the end of the world. There are a lot of smart people out there doing some amazing things with permaculture, transition towns, and more. All we have to do is wake up and realize what direction we're headed in inevitably and start adapting. It's the smart thing to do.
Yeah, and a very, very, very big challenge. The transition town thing is a whole other thing I wish we had time to get into.
Right.
Richard, you're doing wonderful, wonderful work. I commend your books to people. Thank you so much for being with us, Richard Heinberg.
Thank you. You're doing great work too, Thom. Thank you.
Thank you.